In April 2021, the formation of the European Super League was announced in a press release by the 12 clubs who had signed up to be involved. The infamous 12 included the Big Six from England: Manchester United, Liverpool, Arsenal, Manchester City, Chelsea and Tottenham, the Big Three from Italy, Juventus, AC Milan and Inter Milan, and the Big Three from Spain, Real Madrid, Barcelona and Atletico Madrid. Between them, those 12 clubs have won a grand total of 634 trophies, an average of more than 50 trophies per team. Real Madrid, whose president Florentino Perez spearheaded the project, are the most successful, with a grand total of 102 trophies to their name, including a record-breaking 14 UEFA Champions Leagues or European Cups, the competition that the so-called Super League was supposed to supersede. Easy for me to say. While the Super League may have symbolised a tacky cash grab and disdain for the fundamental principles of the sport in a lot of people's eyes, therefore, no one could deny the grandeur or the standing of the clubs that the breakaway league had recruited. Well, all bar one, I suppose. There were those who noted that, among such esteemed company, Tottenham Hotspur looked a little bit like the black sheep of this deeply dysfunctional new family. Not only have Spurs only ever won 2 top-flight league titles and 21 trophies overall, the fewest of any Super League team, they haven't won anything of any description, unless one counts the 2019 pre-season Audi Cup, in over 15 years, since winning the 2008 League Cup, the tertiary domestic trophy within English football. Of course, from the perspective of the European Super League, Tottenham's lack of on-field success was of little importance. This was a competition, quite explicitly, which cared little for sporting merit or achievement. What mattered to Perez and the other stakeholders was Tottenham's commercial success, which has been emphatic. At over £500 million, Spurs have the 8th highest revenue in all of world football and rising, following the move to the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium and constant hikes in ticket prices, ahead of Juventus, Chelsea or AC Milan, and 3 times as much as either Sevilla or Napoli. And yet, Napoli are the reigning champions of Italian football and have won the Coppa Italia thrice since Spurs last won anything, and Sevilla have won 5 of their 7 Europa League crowns in the last 10 years alone. Heck, Leicester City have won both the Premier League and the FA Cup since Tottenham last won anything, and they're currently in the Championship, and both Swansea City and Wigan Athletic have won major silverware more recently than the club from North London. None of this is likely to be news to any of you, least of all Spurs fans, most of whom have spent their entire lives somehow managing to be the butt of every single joke, and having their own club's name turned into an adjective, which is defined in the Collins Dictionary as, quote, "A Spursy performance is to have success in reach, but to ultimately chuck it away." Whilst everyone knows all about Tottenham's difficulties when it comes to winning trophies, and everyone, and I mean everyone, whether that be fans, players or pundits, is very good at mocking them for it, rarely, if ever, have I seen anyone ask the question of just why Tottenham, one of the highest revenue generating clubs in world football, who have finished in the Premier League's top 6 in 14 out of the last 18 seasons, haven't won a league title in 63 years, a European trophy in 40 years, or a competitive trophy of any description in more than 15 years. Well, as you may have guessed by now, today I'm going to do just that. So sit back, relax, and join me on a journey to North London, home of the bustling Camden Market, leafy Hampstead Heath, and, for Spurs fans at least, endless disappointment, as we take a look at the reasons for Tottenham's trophy drought, why Spurs are quite so Spursy, and whether there is a reason for believing that the club's fortunes will turn anytime soon. The first point to address with Tottenham, if we are to look at their lack of trophies throughout the Premier League era, a grand total of 2 League Cups in 32 years, is that Spurs haven't always been the Spurs we now know. Football fans have a tendency to impose the current status quo on all of recorded history. Germany beating Hungary may be par for the course in most of our lifetimes, but in the 1954 World Cup final, it was one of the greatest upsets of all time. Steaua Bucharest winning the European Cup might seem unfathomable now, not least because the competition has been rebranded as the Champions League, but they won it during the same decade that they went on a world record-breaking 119-game unbeaten run, and already, Blackburn Rovers winning the Premier League in 1995 is starting to be portrayed as some kind of fairy tale, as Rovers battle relegation now in the Championship, when, in actual fact, they were the biggest spenders in English football at the time and were top-flight runners-up the previous season. This quasi-form of a collective footballing Mandela effect is doubly true, I suspect, in the case of Tottenham, who were one of the so-called Big Five who spearheaded the Premier League's breakaway from the Football League in 1992 in pursuit of higher revenue for themselves, along with Manchester United, Everton, Liverpool and Arsenal, and they are still one of the big or rich six now, alongside Man United, Liverpool, Arsenal, Man City and Chelsea. Those two bookends, however, over 3 decades apart, overlook a substantial period of time in which Tottenham didn't come close to competing for the biggest prizes. In fact, even when the Premier League launched in 1992, though Spurs were considered to be one of the Big Five at the time, they had finished 10th and 15th in the 2 seasons preceding the league's creation. In the final First Division campaign, Spurs only finished 10 points above the drop and 30 points below title winners Leeds United, who weren't considered to be one of the Big Five. Spurs were included among the Big Five principally because when formal talks about the foundation of the Premier League began, Tottenham had just finished third, their joint highest league finish in almost 30 years, with big-name England players like Paul Gascoigne and Gary Lineker within their ranks. They won the FA Cup in 1991, which was their first trophy in 7 years, and they just built a big new expensive stand at White Hart Lane. In reality, by the time that the Premier League was actually launched, Terry Venables was long gone, and in the summer of 1992, Gascoigne and Lineker both departed for Lazio and Nagoya Grampus 8. Spurs still finished 8th, thanks largely to the goals of Teddy Sheringham, but as soon as he departed to replace Eric Cantona at Manchester United, Tottenham sank like a stone. In the 1997-98 season, Spurs became embroiled in a relegation scrap, and were it not for the January return of Jurgen Klinsmann on loan from Sampdoria, they likely would have gone down. That was Tottenham's closest scrape with relegation, but in the early 2000s, bottom half finishes became the norm. In the 2003-04 season, as North London rivals Arsenal went the entire campaign unbeaten, though they don't like to mention it, Spurs lost 19 games, the second most of any team in the division, the same as Wolves who finished dead last, and more than Leicester who were relegated. This was not, by any stretch of the imagination, a Big Five or Rich Six club. It was only under Martin Jol and later Harry Redknapp that Tottenham established themselves as continental contenders, and even then, it was only really with the appointment of Maurizio Pochettino that Tottenham's top 6 status appeared to be built on solid foundations. In the 2 seasons that Spurs won their only 2 trophies of the Premier League era, 2 League Cups, in the 1998-99 and 2007-08 seasons, they actually finished in the bottom half of the Premier League table, compared to winning nothing during their numerous top 6 finishes. Make of that what you will, and indeed, I have a theory of my own that we're about to come on to. The point being, however, that whilst it is true that Tottenham have finished in the top 6, in 14 out of the last 18 Premier League seasons, they didn't finish in the top 6 once in the 15 seasons before that. Teams who did finish in the top 6 during that time include the likes of Norwich City, Queen's Park Rangers, and Wimbledon, but no one expresses any shock or dismay at the fact that they didn't, and still haven't won anything, during the Premier League era. I think that's an important starting point, hence why I started with it, which means we can basically disregard the period prior to about 2004 and 2005 and say that the primary reason why Tottenham didn't win anything was because, put bluntly, they weren't very good. 18 years is hardly a small sample size though. It is long enough for Phil Foden to go from birth to winning a Premier League title, or for Prince Andrew to, allegedly, consider someone to be too old, and it's difficult to overlook the fact that Spurs won more in their 18 years of being rubbish than they have done in their 18 years of being quite good. In 2001, something significant happened. No, I'm not referring to that. It was significant, I know, but I mean something significant at Tottenham. Following a decade of ownership, which he himself described as a waste of my life, Alan Sugar sold his majority shareholding in Tottenham to the ENIC Group. Ahead of their time in many ways, ENIC operated a multi-club ownership model before the term multi-club ownership model had come into existence. As well as Tottenham, the group owned either significant or majority ownership stakes in Rangers, Slavia Prague, AEK Athens, Vicenza, and FC Basel. Unlike the modern interpretation of the multi-club ownership structure, ENIC's plan wasn't to create an integrated conglomerate of clubs that pooled resources, data, and talent in an attempt to gain some kind of competitive advantage. It was purely a case of noticing a boom in football finances and wanting to get in on the act by acquiring an appreciating asset. This might seem tangential here, but understanding ENIC's motives behind acquiring Tottenham almost entirely explains the just about unique way in which the club has been run. This was a business operation carried out by a holding company with the express intention of making a return on their investment. That doesn't mean, however, that no one connected with the takeover had a personal motivation to see Tottenham succeed on the pitch as well as off it. Joe Lewis, who owned and controlled ENIC at the time, isn't believed to have much of an interest in football, let alone have been a lifelong Spurs fan, but Daniel Levy, who owned and still owns almost a third of the ENIC subsidiary, ENIC International Limited, which made the investment in Tottenham, is a lifelong Spurs fan, having attended his first match during the 1960s at the age of 7 or 8. Levy was the managing director of ENIC International, which he had transformed into a sports, media and entertainment company, and though he was initially appointed as a non-executive director at Tottenham, it soon became clear that Levy would be running the show and calling almost all of the shots. Joe Lewis, in fact, has attended fewer than one game a season since ENIC acquired Tottenham over 20 years ago, preferring to spend his time on a yacht in the tax haven of the Bahamas. For what it's worth, ENIC only acquired an initial 29.9% stake in Tottenham in 2001 because that was the maximum allowed under stock exchange rules before ENIC would have been obliged to launch a bid for the entire company. In 2007, ENIC acquired the rest of Sugar's stake, eventually increasing their shareholding to 86.58%, which is where it currently stands, but effectively, in terms of governance and decision-making, by virtue of being the largest shareholders, Tottenham have been run by ENIC, and by that, what we really mean is by Levy, since 2001. Levy came in at Tottenham with a 5-year plan, which are perhaps the 3 most poisonous words in all of world football, to turn Spurs back into one of the leading clubs in England, and in his 5th full season, Spurs finished 5th. Sugar had long been criticised by Tottenham fans for running the club like a business, and though Lewis may have had much deeper pockets than the genius behind the Amstrad emailer, in an era before the introduction of profit and sustainability or financial fair play restrictions, in which, theoretically at least, ENIC could have spent as much as they liked at Spurs, the strategy amounted essentially to still running Spurs like a business, just a better run one. By that metric, Daniel Levy did a fine job indeed. But as spending ramped up all around Spurs, most notably with Roman Abramovich's arrival at Chelsea, followed by Sheikh Mansour's takeover of Manchester City, Tottenham's attempts to keep up with the big boys was always at risk. When one thinks of the Big Six or Rich Six as they are now, throughout this period, Manchester United, Arsenal and Liverpool all had much higher organic revenue than Spurs, and Chelsea and Man City had oligarchs or nation-states who could more than make up for that gap. It's just sort of taken for granted that Tottenham are one of the Big Six, as though the Big Six were somehow an immutable characteristic or ordained by God, and therefore that they ought to be judged on that basis and subsequently ridiculed for their lack of success in comparison to their peers. The reality, however, is that when ENIC and Levy arrived at Tottenham, Spurs had a lower revenue than both Leeds United and Newcastle United, and about the same as recently promoted Sunderland, who finish above them in both of their first 2 seasons back in the Premier League. Tottenham, therefore, have done exceptionally well to keep pace with clubs who have consistently, and indeed continue to this day, to outspend them by orders of magnitude. This economic disparity between Tottenham and their supposed competitive rivals from the mid-2000s onwards, which was always a mismatch, doesn't just explain why Spurs struggle to keep pace in the Premier League or come close to winning a title, with the possible exception of their second-place finish in 16-17, when they were still 7 points behind Chelsea, but also, I think, why they have fared so poorly in the cup competitions, even compared to teams with smaller budgets and less talented squads. Because Tottenham's Big Six status was so long in the making for Levy, and so precarious even when it was attained, as always the lowest spending and revenue generating club among the six, Spurs have always prioritised the league and the push for continental football because the revenue of competing in Europe was so crucial to them. Whereas Chelsea or Liverpool could drop out of Europe for a season or two, or at least the Champions League, with significant economic consequences, make no mistake, not to mention a painful hit in terms of prestige, their fundamental status as one of the Big Six was never at risk. I mean, Chelsea right now are perhaps the ultimate example of that. The Blues finished 12th last season, which is lower than Spurs have finished in any season since 2003-04, and they are currently languishing in 11th. Nonetheless, the global appeal, status and revenue that they have generated over the last quarter of a century dictates that it will take at least 5 and maybe as many as 10 or 15 years of abysmal league finishes by Chelsea to put their Big Six status in genuine jeopardy, assuming that they avoid relegation, that is, and even that frankly unfathomable outcome wouldn't seal the deal, assuming that they made a speedy return. If you ask Tottenham fans, at any stage over the last 10 years at least, whether they would rather finish in the top 4 or win a League Cup, FA Cup or a Europa League, I suspect that the vast majority of them would favour getting the monkey off their back in terms of never winning anything, so other teams' fans would stop using that as a stick to beat them with, and for their own sense of pride, having gone so long now without winning any silverware. If you ask Daniel Levy that exact same question, again, at any stage over the last 10 years, I suspect that he wouldn't even think twice. Maybe in recent years there would be an element of temptation, almost for selfish reasons, to pick the trophy to take the internal pressure off him from Tottenham fans, though I suspect even that would be superseded by his laser-like focus on increasing revenue. It is a depressing thought in some ways, for supporters at least, but Tottenham aren't unique in this sense. Lots of clubs would take Champions League football over winning any trophy other than the Premier League or the Champions League itself. They are just unique in the amount of importance that they place on revenue generating in that calculation, and for very good reason. If you ask Daniel Levy, he'd tell you that by qualifying for the Champions League or, failing that, at least for the Europa League, Tottenham are able to invest in their playing squad, allowing them to compete again the following season when they would have a better shot at winning something anyway, due to having strengthened. Whereas Birmingham City, Swansea City, Portsmouth, Wigan Athletic and Leicester City may all have won trophies more recently than Tottenham, another thing that they all have in common is that they have all been relegated, and indeed, not a single one of them is currently in the top flight. Where the theory falls down, of course, is that Spurs have consistently qualified for Europe for almost 2 decades, and that ability to invest and strengthen their playing squad season upon season hasn't, as of yet, heralded that we'll have a better shot next season trophy as promised. There are Tottenham fans, and I know this for a fact, who would swap their last 10 years, trophyless but regulars in Europe with massive revenue growth, for Leicester City's, an FA Cup and Premier League title but relegated last season and now in the Championship, but for Daniel Levy, that would be no trade-off at all, and a frankly absurd notion, which I think speaks to a discord, not just at Tottenham but in football more broadly, between how chairman and owners think when compared to fans. This hyper-focus on league finishes above all else, at the expense of the cup competitions, I think also perhaps explains why Tottenham's 2 trophies in the last 30 years, the 1999 and 2008 League Cups, came during campaigns in which they finished 11th. Spurs had no hope of qualifying for Europe on both occasions, hence, unusually, they could throw all of their eggs into one basket when it came to pursuing cup success. It is just worth noting at this stage that there is always an element of fortune and misfortune in football, and Tottenham's trophylessness is no exception. There is a danger, perhaps, when making all of these arguments, that the fact that Spurs have come very close to winning 2 or 3 trophies during that time gets overlooked. The year after winning their last trophy, the 2008 League Cup, Spurs reached yet another League Cup final, where they drew 0-0 against Manchester United, who won the Premier League title and only lost to prime Barcelona in the Champions League final that season, and Spurs only lost to them on penalties. They were back at Wembley for another League Cup final in 2015, where they lost 2-0 against Chelsea, who also won the Premier League title that season. Again in 2021, where they were narrowly beaten by, you guessed it, that season's Premier League champions Manchester City, and of course, in 2018-19, Tottenham reached the Champions League final, having overcome Borussia Dortmund, Manchester City, and Ajax during the knockout stages, only to fall to an underwhelming 2-0 defeat against Premier League rivals Liverpool. On top of those 4 finals, Spurs have reached a further 5 semi-finals, meaning that they have reached the last 4 of at least one cup competition in most of the last 15 seasons, which, under any normal circumstances, for most clubs, would result in some kind of success. It is here that the Spursy accusation gets thrown around, and whilst I think misfortune and economic factors provide far better explanations for Tottenham's lack of trophies, I don't think that it can be as readily dismissed as some might hope. It makes little sense that historic precedent, pedigree, or previous results should determine current or future ones, especially when players and coaches come and go with such speed in the modern game, and yet, the reality, frustrating as it may be, is that it appears that it does. Liverpool's perennial success in the Champions League, for example, even when they were nowhere near winning the Premier League, feels like it can only be explained, or at least only in part, by a sense of belief in that competition, which is implanted in players due to the club's historic success within it. Whatever that winning mentality or sense of belief is, which becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, Tottenham appear to have it in reverse. I think a similar phenomenon is true when it comes to the England national team, who, like Tottenham, have long been one of the better teams on the international stage, routinely qualify and make it through to the knockout stages of tournaments, but seem to have a certain mental block when it comes to getting over the line, which I think was fairly evident in their 2018 World Cup and Euro 2020 exits against Croatia and Italy, as you could see the belief slowly drain out of them. To be clear, I'm not saying that's the biggest reason for Tottenham or England's lack of success, or even the second or third. Just that, however minor, I think it probably is a factor which, however illogical, cannot be dismissed. Also, as with England, it really bears reiterating that it's not easy winning trophies. Spurs may be the poster boys of trophylessness in England, but several other clubs can attest to that fact. Their North London rivals Arsenal haven't won a Premier League title in 20 years, Liverpool have only won 1 during the entire Premier League era, and Leicester City are the only team from outside of the Big Six to have won either the Premier League, the FA Cup, or the League Cup over the last 10 years. Arsenal, famously, have never won the Champions League and have actually only won half as many, 2 versus 4, European trophies as Spurs. Manchester City only won their first Champions League last season after 15 years of intense spending under Emirati ownership, and the mighty Manchester United, the biggest and most decorated English club, have only won the Champions League twice since becoming the first English club to win it 56 years ago. For all of the talk of England's domestic cup competitions having been devalued, much of it true, the idea that the big clubs no longer take them seriously is nonsense. Since Swansea City won the League Cup in 2013, 11 years ago, only 4 teams, Manchester City, Manchester United, Chelsea and Liverpool, have won England's tertiary trophy, and 7 out of the 11 finals during that time have been exclusively Big Six affairs. Perhaps the biggest knock-on effect of Tottenham's lower budget, or at least the most relevant when it comes to cup competitions and prioritising the league, is the lack of depth that they have had. Even in the 2016-17 season, which was peak Tottenham under Maurizio Pochettino, and indeed peak Tottenham during the Premier League era overall, as they finished as Premier League runners-up on 86 points, which is more than Arsenal won last season, who do you suppose was their backup centre-forward behind Harry Kane, or their third-choice centre-back behind Jan Vertonghen and Toby Alderweireld? I'll tell you who. Vincent Janssen was the backup striker behind Kane, a man who scored a grand total of 2 goals in 31 games in the Premier League. Georges Kevin Nkudu was Son Heung-min's deputy on the left flank, the scorer of precisely 0 goals in 19 Premier League games, and who now plays for a team that you have never heard of, called Damak in the Saudi Pro League at the age of 29. And Kevin Wimmer was Tottenham's only senior backup centre-back. No, I'm not kidding, behind Vertonghen and Alderweireld, a man who left the following summer to join Stoke City, where he would go down as one of the worst Premier League signings of all time, and who now plays for Slovan Bratislava in Slovakia at the age of only 31. Of course, all clubs have depth issues, but few, particularly at the highest level, are that extreme, and that can become a real problem, as Tottenham have repeatedly found out. When injuries hit, the games come thick and fast, and you need to rotate in the cup competitions, a problem which, as we've established, is heightened for Spurs due to their fixation on the league. When you look at Tottenham's spending, it's easy to see why that has been a problem. In the 2018-19 season, which was simultaneously Mauricio Pochettino's last full season at Spurs and the season in which the club moved into the new Tottenham Hotspur Stadium, Spurs had by far the lowest budget among the Big Six. And when I say by far, what I mean is that Tottenham's wage bill was just £179 million, which was £53 million less than the next lowest Big Six club Arsenal, only £19 million more than Everton, and over £100 million less than Chelsea, Liverpool, Man City or Man United's. By that metric, therefore, Tottenham were actually closer to the chasing pack, whether that be Everton, Leicester, or even West Ham, than they were to the rest of the Big Six. The same is true in terms of net spend. In the 5 years up to and including the 2018-19 season, Tottenham had a net spend of less than £30 million, compared to over £500 million at Man City, that is, over £500 million, £470 million at Manchester United, and £240 million at Arsenal. Heck, Everton, who not only won nothing during that period, but consistently finished lower and came nowhere near as close as Tottenham to winning anything, had a net spend in excess of £200 million, which may help to explain some of their recent problems. Part of that is because, even during their consistent top 4 finishes under Pochettino, Spurs have never quite been able to shake off their reputation as a so-called selling club, occupying a position that sits just slightly outside of the elite. From Michael Carrick, who left Tottenham to join Manchester United in 2006, to Robbie Keane, Dimitar Berbatov, Luka Modric, Gareth Bale, Kyle Walker, and most recently, of course, Harry Kane in 2023, that has run like a thread throughout Tottenham's modern past. In many ways, however, the progression of those sales tells a tale about the progression of Tottenham themselves. For a start, all were sold for considerable sums, reflecting the nous that Daniel Levy has consistently shown within the transfer market, rarely letting players run down their deals or leave for nothing, as happened with Sol Campbell only months after he arrived. Secondly, whereas Carrick was sold after just 2 seasons at White Hart Lane, and on the same day that he turned 25, Spurs got 4 seasons out of Luka Modric, 6 out of Bale, 6 out of Walker, and 10 out of Harry Kane, who only departed last summer after turning 30 and having become Tottenham's all-time leading goalscorer. Kane's departure stung for Spurs fans, inevitably, but in some ways, the amount of time that they were able to keep hold of him represents progress, along with the fact that Kane's brother was a terrible agent, but that's a slightly different issue. In recent years, there has been a clear shift at Tottenham. Jose Mourinho and Antonio Conte are coaches who are brought in with trophies and immediate results in mind, unlike Mauricio Pochettino, who had never won anything, but had illustrated an ability to build a squad and develop players in the long term. Fundamentally, of course, Mourinho and Conte were also much more expensive appointments than Pochettino, reflecting an increased investment at Tottenham in recent years. From a £179 million wage bill in 2018-19, over £50 million less than Arsenal's, in the 2021-22 accounts, Tottenham's wage bill had risen to £209 million, almost the exact same as Arsenal's at £212 million, and some way clear of Leicester, Newcastle and Everton. It is a similar story in terms of spending. over the last 4 seasons, Tottenham have the 4th highest net spend in the Premier League, above Manchester City and Liverpool at more than £450 million. Spurs have gone from being the only Premier League club to record a profit for 7 successive seasons, totaling more than £400 million of profit, making them the highest profit-generating club in the league, to losing money in each of the last 3 sets of accounts, 2020, 2021 and 2022, totaling some £209 million. On the face of it, it is a drastic shift, and in some ways it is. But compared to their peers, Spurs' spending isn't as extravagant as it may initially seem. While there has been a change in tact, the primary cause of Tottenham's increased spending on wages, transfer fees, and coaching staff has been brought about by the move to the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium. Tottenham's new stadium changes everything, and I'm not being melodramatic. In terms of the sheer numbers, it has doubled Tottenham's matchday revenue from just over £50 million at White Hart Lane to well in excess of £100 million now. In the last set of accounts, Spurs shot up to being the 2nd highest revenue generating team via matchday revenue in the Premier League, trailing only Manchester United, and in the next accounts, which will be published any time now, it is widely anticipated that Spurs will have leapfrogged the Red Devils into top spot in the Premier League. Tottenham's matchday revenue, if you can believe it, is already higher than Real Madrid's at over twice the size of Juventus's, and in the next set of accounts, they may well overtake PSG and move into 2nd in the European rankings, trailing only Barcelona. This has catapulted Tottenham from sitting outside of the top 10 of the Deloitte Football Money League at White Hart Lane to ranking 8th last season above Chelsea, Arsenal, Inter Milan and Juventus during a campaign in which they finished 8th in the Premier League and didn't get beyond the last 16 in any cup competition. It's not just Tottenham's own matchday revenue. The Spurs accounts will be boosted by hosting other major events like NFL games, boxing, and most notably, a series of Beyoncé concerts, which are believed to have pocketed the club an 8-figure sum. It's possible, as bizarre as this sentence may sound, that Beyoncé has effectively paid Guillermo Vicario's transfer fee. What all of this means, even more importantly however, is that Tottenham's Big Six status is no longer under constant threat and shouldn't feel as precarious as it has done for the last 10 or 15 years. Spurs were the highest revenue generating team in London in 2023 and were within touching distance of Liverpool. That should mean that Tottenham have a greater sense of self-confidence and a greater willingness to take risks in terms of the cup competitions, weather the storm of missing out on Europe, if and when it happens, as it did last season, and ultimately have a better shot at winning trophies. The chaos that is currently engulfing the Premier League in terms of profit and sustainability breaches, or clubs who aren't yet in breach but are treading on thin ice and may have to sell players in order to avoid sanctions, ought to leave Tottenham in a huge revenue-generating stadium which hasn't even got a potentially lucrative naming rights deal yet, having always spent within their means and at far less risk of breaching PSR than pretty much all of their rivals, very well placed to pounce over the next few years. Daniel Levy stated in 2023, quote, "We made footballing decisions over recent seasons based on ambition and a desire to bring success to our club." End quote. A tacit admission, it would seem, not that Levy is too secretive about it, that in previous years, Tottenham's decision-making had been motivated by finances above all else. When Enoch and Levy took control of Tottenham in 2001, acquiring 29.9% of the club's shares for £22 million, and later the rest of Sugar's shares for £25 million, Tottenham was valued at around 50 to, at the very most, £80 million. Now, Forbes consider Tottenham to be the 9th most valuable football club in the world, and rising, valued at close to £3 billion. That's an increase, during that time, of almost 5,000%. The S&P 500, by comparison, which tracks the 500 largest companies in the United States, has risen by 282% during that time. Enoch and Levy, therefore, through their investment in Tottenham, have outperformed the market by a magnitude of almost 18 to 1. Which raises the question, what is success? On the pitch, it is hard to define the last 20 years at Tottenham as having been successful, at least when it comes to trophies. 1 League Cup, which is the same trophy haul as Middlesbrough, Birmingham and Swansea during that time, is a pretty pitiful return for a club which felt at home signing up to a supposed European Super League. As an asset, however, and as a business venture, Tottenham has been a phenomenal success for Levy and for Enoch. They would argue that their management has left Tottenham in a far better state than when they inherited the club, and that much is inarguable. Whether it leaves them primed to capitalise upon the chaos that surrounds them in terms of PSR, aided by a monumental cash cow that cost £1 billion to build with long-term low-interest loans, which is the same amount that Chelsea have spunked on players in the last 2 seasons, still remains to be seen. Daniel Levy has long talked about PSR, FFP, and the importance of sustainability. For a long time, that frustrated Tottenham fans, as they saw their rivals outspend them and win trophies while they carefully balanced the books. It's not hard to imagine a world, however, as Man City face 115 charges, Chelsea have spent the GDP of a small nation with little return, Man United may have to sell in order to buy, and Newcastle almost certainly will, where Levy is vindicated, and the mocking of Tottenham over the last 20 years turns into envy. In some ways, therefore, Tottenham's success or failure when it comes to winning trophies over the next 2 to 3 to 5 to 10 years may rest as much with whether the Premier League bears their teeth in terms of implementing their own rules to the biggest clubs and stands firm in terms of the current framework of PSR as it will with the decisions that they make themselves. That is it for today's video. There was loads more planned, but this is very long and, to be quite frank, my throat is killing me. Maybe there'll be a second Spurs video at some stage, because there is a slightly strange ownership situation there, which I would have liked to have discussed, but it would have been about 20 minutes in of itself. Anyway, thank you all very much, as ever, for watching. Hit the like button if you enjoyed it. I hope that was the case, obviously. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and it goes without saying by this stage, but I will remind you nonetheless to make sure that you're subscribed and have notifications turned on, not just for this channel, HITC Sevens, but also my second channel, Alfie Potsama, both of which should be about to appear on your screens now, along with a couple of videos that you might enjoy watching after this one. You can also find me on Twitter, Instagram or Threads by the username @HITC Sevens on all 3, should you wish to do so, and all of those links plus a whole lot more should be down in the video description below. Cheers.